Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm John James and I'm passionate about enabling change and innovation. That's the reason I'm hosting this series of webinars where we can explore and discuss enabling change and innovation. The technology that we're using today is really easy for you to use. So here's an image of the GoToWebinar floating control panel. It's fully expanded when you first see it, but hey, the clever little thing hides itself after a couple of minutes so that you can better concentrate on the presentation. But if at any time you want to expand it again, just click on the little orange arrow and it'll expand out again. Most of you I see have joined using the computer microphone and speakers, and there's also the telephone available, and you don't look at the numbers on my screen but use the ones in your audio control panel. Now can I just quickly test if you can, I'll just show you this one first though. So here's how you can interact. So on the floating control panel there's a little hand here. So hey, can I just test now, if you can hear me loud and clear, can you please click and raise your virtual hand? Great, I see lots of hands there, so that's good, thank you very much. And if you click again, the hand will go down. Now, at any stage during today's presentation, you can type your questions in the small box at the bottom here. Now, only the organisers get to see what you type, so it doesn't go to the whole audience. And that way, if you ask a question, I'll read it out so it's nice and anonymous for you. Now, there's been quite a lot of interest in today's webinar, with almost 200 people registering. I can see that we have folks from most parts of Australia, and I can see some familiar names on the list there. And there's several overseas locations as well. I'm not sure if they're all here, but hey, we had folk from the following countries register for the webinar: Cuba, Egypt, Fiji, India, Iran, Ireland, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, South Africa, Thailand, and the good old USA. So what a roll-up. So it's great that you've been able to be part of today's inaugural audience. So let's get a picture of who is with us today. So on the screen in front of you now, you should see a poll, and it's asking, where are you normally located? So can you just quickly indicate there by clicking one of the options there? Great. I'll just close that off in a couple of seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Close that. And now I'll share those results with you. So it's no great surprise, but there are a lot of people from Australia here today, but it's lovely to have some Kiwis with us, some people from Asia and Canada, and also from America. And if you're from another country, if you type in the Q&A box at the bottom in a moment, I'll be able to see where you're coming from. So folks, it's great to have you here. I'll just hide that now. Now, today's webinar is brought to you by a partnership between the Queensland Government, for whom I have the pleasure of working, APEN, our professional organisation for extension in Australasia, and Citrix GoToWebinar, who are actually subsidising the costs for us. And we'll hear a bit more about those towards the end of the webinar. Now, don't leave too quickly at the end, as I do have a special announcement. Now, in just a moment, we'll be hearing from today's guest presenter. Now, personally, I find the whole area of being able to predict future adoption levels very interesting, but also very challenging. I can recall reading many funding applications where people promise the world. So they categorically state that as a result of their project, the innovation will be utilised by 25, 50, and even 75% of their target audience, and of course, all by the end of their 3-year project. When I've challenged some of these people as to what numbers they have actually used, they often say that it just seemed a good number, and it's as if they, to me, it's as if they'd pulled the number out of a hat. Now, while working with enabling change and innovation can be magical, it can also be based on some good hard science. And today we have the pleasure of having Rick Llewellyn to talk to us about predicting and improving adoption of agricultural innovations. Rick is a research group leader in agricultural systems with CSIRO, based at the Waite campus in Adelaide, South Australia. His research interests bridge farming systems field research, economics, and understanding technology adoption. He has a Bachelor of Agricultural Science from the University of Adelaide and a PhD in Agricultural Economics from the University of Western Australia. Over the past 10 years, he's published over 40 refereed articles on adoption of agricultural practices. He is speaking with us today as the leader of the Future Farm Industries CRC project that has developed the Adoption and Diffusion Outcome Prediction Tool, commonly known as ADOPT. So Rick, it's great to have you here today. Over to you.
Thanks, John, and good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for listening. Now, this is my first ever webinar, so thanks to John James, the innovator, for dragging us later adopters into this world of online webinars. Yeah, so I look forward to sharing the project we've been working on for the last couple of years with you, and we won't just be focusing on the tool that we've developed, but also the general topic of predicting and improving adoption of agricultural innovations. Now,
and that's good, thanks Rick. You're coming through loud and clear, and we are seeing your first slide and now the second. That's great.
Okay,
it's all working.
The first thing, excellent. Now the first thing I'd like to do is just introduce some of the people who have been involved with this project with the CRC Future Farm Industries. And what we've done with this team is bring together a range of disciplines and a range of people. So we've got rural sociologists, some other social researchers, agricultural economists, and farming systems researchers with, through the CRC. This is Mike Ewing and Perry Dolling and Roger Wilkinson with Vic DPI as a rural sociologist. Jeff Keeney was the postdoc doctoral fellow who worked on this project throughout, and David Pennell, an agricultural economist from the University of Western Australia. Now the objectives of what we wanted to achieve were to make adoption and diffusion considerations much more available and understandable and hopefully applicable from non-experts and people involved with projects aiming for on-ground practice change. And along the lines of that, we wanted to produce a tool that could predict the likely rate and level of adoption for specific practices in particular populations. So it was a bold objective, and along the way, the aim, and in particular for the CRC Future Farm Industries, for initiating this project, was to inform the research, development and extension strategies that they were putting in place around particular practices. And I should point out that it wasn't just our aim to focus on prediction. If it was, we would have ended up with a very different product to the one that I'll be presenting today. But we realise it's also important to inform and engage. So what we have developed has been very much directed or guided, I guess, by the intention that it would be a tool that would be widely used by people who aren't necessarily directly involved with research, for example, into adoption of new practices. So why does this still need doing after such a long history of adoption and diffusion research? Well, as John indicated, there are still many poor and costly adoption strategies and assumptions made that can be very misleading for the directions of projects and R&D strategies. And the common approach that you tend to see found to be used is unstructured guesswork. It's the most common tool. Despite there being a regular need to make forecasts or estimates of likely impact and adoption, you still see that the back of the envelope type approaches are still the most common tool. And there is a vast adoption literature and an enormous amount of understanding in the literature and amongst experts around the place, and the intention was to try and distill that and bring it together, or at least some of that. And really, when you look at the massive amount of studies that have been done, most of them are retrospective, which is generally how they need to be, looking back and trying to understand what has happened in terms of adoption and diffusion of practices in the past and trying to understand the drivers of that. But very little effort has been made to apply it forward. How can we take that knowledge and apply it in a readily applicable way to considering what might happen in future scenarios, which is generally the direction we're looking with new projects. And it also has to be said that I guess a big reason why we were encouraged in this area was demand. quite an obvious demand, and it's a demand that's become much more apparent after we've developed this tool and set on this path, that there is a very obvious demand for people wanting to assistance, I guess, in predicting likely impacts, and in particular looking at the likely drivers of different adoption and diffusion results. From a research and development corporation or anyone involved with R&D investment, I guess the basis for interest comes from considering this common equation, essentially, for investment in R&D and the effect of adoption on achieving research benefits. So here you've got the research costs and, of course, a lag before research benefits are achieved. And with improved strategies for adoption, product development, research and development, and extension, there are the opportunities to bring that forward, so increase the research benefits by accelerating the time, or reduce the time it takes to reach that peak. But there's also the opportunity, of course, to improve the quality or the advantages of a particular innovation that could potentially increase the peak of adoption. So there's a number of ways, not just accelerating the time to peak adoption, but also increasing the overall impact in terms of the number of people who will benefit from it, or the amount of land that will benefit from an innovation. And we consider those two things quite differently in the approach that I'm about to describe. So ADOPT, the Adoption and Diffusion Outcome Prediction Tool. It was started by the Future Farm Industry, CRC, in 2009 as they were developing their first projects, and they really did want to try and embed some of the adoptability approaches that some of their team members had been taking into their approach for new farm practices, and hence this their brave investment in this project, which is much appreciated. Along the way, the work we've been doing has been developed with industry piloting and some substantial involvement from the Grains GRDC, the Grains Research and Development Corporation, and integrating the approach and the very early versions of the tool into some of their processes for new initiatives, which was very useful for us in developing where the market and what the tool would need to be able to achieve to be successful. A number of workshops right around Australia were conducted, and a lot of effort made to get feedback and validation exercises. The beta version that some of you may have was released in December 2011, and we consider that very much a beta version. This is a work in progress, and we hope that webinars such as this might encourage more feedback for us in terms of developing the tool further. And to help us do that, new partnerships are starting to be formed to look at further development and also adaptation into new uses. The current tool's been developed very much with broadacre Australian agriculture, I guess, in mind, so there are certainly opportunities to increase its applicability to other industries and regional scenarios. So that's the tool that some of you will have seen, or at least the front page of it. And back to you, John. I think you've got a poll to conduct.
I do indeed. So we've now got a question for you that you should be able to see on the screen. So to help Rick pitch his presentation today, we'd like to know, how familiar are you with ADOPT? So select one of the above. First time I've heard about it, heard a bit about it, downloaded the program but not used it, downloaded, used it once or twice, downloaded, used it several times. So just click one of those. And there we go. I see about 80% have responded. This is good. Just another couple of seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'll close it off there. So here we go, Rick. That gives you a good idea there that at least half of the people have heard about it before. And go.
Okay, back to the next slide.
Well, that's it. Yep. So we're seeing the poll slide. So if you go to the next one.
Okay, questions?
Great. So folks, we're pausing now to enable you to ask some questions, and we'll do this a few times through the presentation, because I don't know about you, but I get a bit frustrated when I'm sitting through a presentation and there's a question that if it were answered right at the beginning would just put me out of my misery. So folks, you can type your questions in the bottom panel there and I'll read them out. So just looking at the moment, no, it seems all straightforward at the moment, thanks Rick. So how about we move on, and folks, if at any stage you do have some questions, you can type them there, although actually there is now a question here. So Rick, what industries so far have you been working with the ADOPT program?
Well, initially, because of its basis with the CRC Future Farm Industries, it's a lot of the early development and applications were around mixed farming in broadacre Australian agriculture, like I mentioned. But along the way, and also with the GRDC as well, so in cropping regions. In terms of validation, we've done exercises through Jeff Keeney's work with the cotton industry and several other industries, looking at how well it applies more broadly. And at the moment, we're talking with ACR about the potential to expand its use into smallholder developing country agriculture, which will require a few modifications and revalidation. But so far, most of the application for us has been in that broadacre Australian agriculture space, but we've had well over 200 downloads for different organisations right across. So the application of the beta version is something that we'll be keen to hear about in a survey we'll be conducting with the downloaders in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Rick. And of course, everyone, we'll share with you the web address of where you can download the program at the end of the webinar. And you'll also be receiving a link to a recording of today's webinar and also a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. So you'll get an email afterwards. So, Rick, I think that's probably answered all the questions at the moment about that. So, yeah, please move on.
Okay, so there's several approaches you could take to explaining or understanding adoption or the diffusion path of a particular innovation. It's attracted the research attention of a number of different disciplines and a number of different theoretical bases for understanding that. The approach we've taken is a paradigm, I guess you'd say, that's very much based on adoption as a learning process. It's one that's commonly been found in the economics literature, but also relates much more widely than that. So it really is about explaining why the adoption process or diffusion curves look like the way they do, and the reasoning for that being around it's a learning process that takes time, and that learning being about learning of the actual relative advantage of a particular innovation to the potential user. Now, in other ways, this has been described as its pattern's been described using risk, other personal attributes, but this is the approach that we've taken. So very much learning, starting with high uncertainty, learning, reducing that uncertainty, and where there is actual relative advantage, once that's firmly understood, the chance of adoption increasing, and hence the range of times to adoption that you see it. So that's the basis for our model, and we'll explain a little bit more about that soon. Firstly, though, just a look at the classic diffusion of an innovation assumption, and you'll find this common across no matter what disciplinary approach you might take to adoption, and it's the classic sigmoid or S-shaped adoption curve. And I guess the important point that we wanted to make about this, and it's certainly the basis of how we present our results in terms of forecasting adoption, is that there are different drivers at different stages of that diffusion curve. So you can see the cumulative adoption curve there, the diffusion curve there in orange. So the personal characteristics and the characteristics of the population or individuals related to learning are known to be particularly important early when uncertainty is high, so there's more to be learnt and potentially more impact from extension, research or information. And generally in studies you find that is when extension and that sort of information can have the largest impact. Of course, later in the process. There's more likelihood that you'll learn from neighbours and more is known about a particular innovation, so there's less potential for impact there. And in this sort of theoretical approach, it's the peak adoption level is determined by actual relative advantage. And it's important to point out that we're not just talking about profitability there. There's a whole spectrum of factors that lead to relative advantage, whether something's better than what's being used currently. And it's just an important separation, I guess, in the approach that we've taken to teasing apart the factors that might influence adoption. The important point to make also is that actual relative advantage, that's how good the innovation might be, is also an important driver back here early, because obviously something that has clear actual relative advantage, it's much more easy to learn about that than something which only has marginal or more complexity involved in seeing that actual relative advantage. Now, that is a very theoretical approach to how you might consider things, but in terms of examples that have been experienced, this is as good a data set and study as you'll find. It's the diffusion of lupins across the 1980s and early 90s in Western Australia. And the first thing, of course, is that you do see roughly the classic shape of the diffusion curve. And the study was also important for us and others in showing that the influence of extension, in this case consultants and Department of Agriculture, was shown through the econometrics in this case used to have particular influence back early, and the final peak levels determined much more by the likely performance or actual relative advantage of the crop in those different regions. So that's just one of the data sets that we've used to help us guide the validation and calibration of this tool. We've also looked at this no-till adoption, another example of where you do see the classic form of diffusion, in this case with no-till practices across a whole range of different Australian cropping regions, and you can see different plateauing levels in different regions. So back to the framework that we've used, and this is how we've broken those different factors up into 4 quadrants. First of all, looking at the top half there, population characteristics. So it's the important thing that we've tried to do, particularly when encouraging people to consider adoption, is to really characterise the population and define the population carefully, have a clear idea of who you are delivering to, and in some cases that might involve splitting the population into segments that deserve to be treated or considered differently. But first of all, on the top left, you've got learning characteristics of the population, so their ability or their networks that would mean that they are likely to learn of the likely advantages of an innovation, and in the first instance, awareness of an innovation. We'll break these down into the different components later. The other population characteristics in the top there are the population characteristics that would influence the relative advantage. So, for example, an innovation that has a particular environmental or strongly environmental benefit, if that population is have characteristics that would value environmental outcomes more highly, then that's an important characteristic in explaining the likely adoption rates for that particular innovation. Down the bottom we have the characteristics that are specific to the innovation itself, regardless of the population. The first is the classic learnability characteristics of the innovation, and that's where we've tried as hard as we can to draw on the sort of classic literature, Rogers in particular. We've drawn heavily on the Rogers in terms of maintaining the language around innovation characteristics. We generally haven't taken the similar approach that he took to classifying adopter characteristics, but in terms of characteristics of the innovation, complexity, trialability, observability, that's where they sit in our framework. The ability to characteristics of the innovation that allow more rapid learning. Relative advantage characteristics of the innovation, so basically the range of characteristics, like I suggested earlier, that contribute to the actual advantage that it would have for a potential adopter. So the quadrants work out that you've got the learning characteristics on the left, relative advantage related characteristics on the right. Were there any interim questions there, John, that you wanted to seek?
Yes. Glad you asked. So can we just clarify the adopt program? It's essentially an Excel spreadsheet, isn't it, that can run on either a Mac or a PC?
That's right. It is based in Excel, and up to this point we sort of intend to keep it that way at this stage. And it is a quantitative tool, and it's no argument, I guess, that it is a reductionist approach to considering adoption. You do need to bring these things into quantitative measures and really distill down the enormous range of factors that can potentially influence adoption to just core consistent elements, which I'll talk a little bit more about lately. But it is a downloadable tool that can be, and we'll show more about that later.
Okay, great. Now, Rick, if just testing your skills here, if you go back half a dozen slides, you had a graph and there were 2 lines on it, and I think one was yellow, one was blue. Can you just flip back to that one?
All right.
I think, yes, that's right. So can you just explain again what the blue line is and what the yellowy-orange line is, please?
Yeah, okay, so there's two ways to represent the same occurrence. So the orange is the cumulative proportion of people adopting. Okay, so over time you're starting off with a low level back here, and as the percentage of people in a target population increases, you're reaching this plateau at the top here. For some innovations that may be very low, maybe as low as 5 or 10%. For other highly successful and widely successful innovations, that could be an entire population reaching 100% up here. Down here is a different way of, I guess, representing the proportion of adopters, and I've left the labels off, but for those who do follow the Rogers approach, you traditionally back here, the first adopters you'd categorise as the innovators, and then you've got the early and late majority through the middle here, and the very late adopters, and to use the word laggards, but that's what you would find if you went back to the Rogers text, for example. So that's just a way of categorising. We generally don't take that approach to characterising the individuals or the population in that way. It's all expressed through the relative advantage and the time to adoption through the cumulative adoption curve.
Okay. So if you could now just go forward to your quadrant model there, that's the one. So just a couple of questions regarding there. So, and Rick, I understand that there's 22 key questions, aren't there, that people will work through as part of your program?
That's right, that's right. In the current beta version, it comes down to just 22, and I'll explain a little bit more about how they were settled upon.
Okay. And just regarding your quadrant framework here, there's a question about, is the role of trust considered in this tool? I mean, trust on early adopters and or sources of information.
No, that's a good point, and some of those similar sort of traits or characteristics, are regularly suggested in our workshops. The difficulty that we have is in including something like that is it's very difficult to, I guess, reliably characterise a population or the source of information in that way. There's no denying that that's often important, but it's the ability of, say, an expert panel to characterise a population from some distance to be able to rate and score, and then be confident that in this particular case it is an important factor. So there's the ability to characterise and the ability to, I guess, expect a consistent response from that means that some factors like that didn't make the final model.
Okay. And how predictable is relative advantage?
There's a couple of approaches. I mean, with our validation exercises, you're able to look back, so you get a good feel for the actual relative advantage after some time in terms of the impact it can have. But generally, in a lot of cases, people will be looking forward where they don't really know the likely relative advantage or can't easily observe it. In some applications, that's been done using environmental measures, some profitability measures, for example, or even labour demand type measures. So in some cases there'll be a need to, it's not part of ADOPT to predict what the actual relative advantage is. That's something that needs to be fed in from other sources. So that's an important distinction to make, that you do need a way to predict the relative advantage to get a good result from this model.
That's good. Rick, I'm conscious we've got over 100 people joining us today, and they've all got lots of good questions, but I'm also conscious that we're now halfway through the time allocated today. So let's move forward, please.
Okay. So we'll look more specifically at the ADOPT tool, and you've touched on some of these already, John. So what ADOPT does, and it's probably also important to make clear what it doesn't do and what we don't intend it to do. So it's very much dealing with populations, so diffusion, which is the spread of adoption decisions across a population. So it's not in any way pretending to predict the decision of an individual. I mean, it's a crazy brave effort to attempt to predict diffusion, and it would be even or simply crazy to try and use a tool like this to predict the decision of an individual with certainty. So because of all those different small a whole range of factors that can influence that. But in terms of predicting across the whole population what the likely pattern of diffusion might be, we think we're on a little bit safer ground. So it is just an important distinction that, yes, there are lots of factors that are important that influence the decisions of individuals, but here we're looking at the general pattern of diffusion across a population. And as we've touched on, we're not attempting to include all factors. We recognise there's a whole range of factors that can be very important in different situations, but the criteria that we've had to use is it needs a very consistent response in terms of direction. So a particular factor needs a consistent response, and an example would be something like age, which is a classic factor to include in adoption studies, but you do find a very inconsistent response. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative in terms of its influence on rate or extent of adoption. So that is generally not included because it's very difficult to predict. And the other criteria is that it needs to be readily attainable. You need to be able to characterise a population relatively easily, and you need to be able to characterise differences between populations. So there's many factors where that is very difficult to do, and mainly for that reason some factors haven't been included. So the quadrant model that I showed earlier expands into something that looks like this, and without going into the equations in the tool, this is how things interact within the ADOPT framework and in the tool itself. So we'll just quickly go around some of the quadrants. So at the top you've got the population. It's a population-based quadrant, and it's about that learnability, the ability to learn about an innovation, and that's where you see, in this case, advisory support, extension involvement or group involvement. And I guess the important thing to consider here is that they do sort of trade off, they do come together. So for example, where they go into those yellow boxes, where there is a high level of advisory support instead of consultant use, for example, then group involvement is probably weighted less in the end. And similarly, where there's high levels of existing skills and knowledge, some of these other learnability characteristics would become less important. So that's why you find when you use the tool that some changes to some variables may not make a big difference, because perhaps there are other factors that are already leading to high learnability, for example. Going around and going down to the learnability characteristics of innovation, so this is where you see, for those familiar with some of the language around innovation adoption, so trialability, complexity, observability, the ability to observe the use of an innovation in the local district by neighbours, for example. And if you do go to some of the original definitions of that, you do find that often they have multiple components. In creating a tool like this, we've had to focus on sort of single components of these definitions and try and capture some of the other factors elsewhere. But as much as possible, we've tried to keep it consistent with the familiar language around considering innovations. Just going around to the other quadrant. Now, this is where there are a number of factors, and because it is such an important driver of both the rate and peak levels of adoption, and that's relative advantage. So you can see here that it's certainly not just profit. We have profit, and it's broken into both short-term profit as well as sort of long-term benefits that are discounted. So the further those benefits might be away, the less value they contribute to overall relative advantage. But there's other important factors here, and I'd argue increasingly important factors in considering adoptability of practices such as ease and convenience, the risk, and other factors like reversibility, which we've attributed to a factor that influences the likely investment cost, and that's the ability to, if you're taking on an innovation, what cost would it be, or how difficult would it be to actually reverse out of that decision? So there's a range of factors there, not just profitability, that we're considering in relative advantage. And in terms of the population, characterising the population, this is where some of those factors such as trust, which came up before, and some of those things could be included, but we've kept it very simple in terms of characterising the overall population. Often these are kept at defaults when you're running this within the same industry, but you're looking at, in some examples, for example, if you're looking at a target population that may be very environmentally oriented, targeting Landcare Group members in particular or something like that, you've got the opportunity to influence the characterisation of the population in terms of how important some of these relative advantage factors are to them and how they contribute to the overall relative advantage. So that's the framework, and you can see here that it's relative advantage that leads directly to peak adoption level, as well as across the time to peak adoption, but you've got these learnability characteristics that are the contributors to time to peak adoption, and they don't in this framework contribute across to relative advantage or the actual peak adoption level. Were there any, run through that very quickly, but that is included in the tool if people did download it. Are there any questions there, John?
Oh yes, just a few dozen. So if you could just go back to the previous slide, please, Rick.
I can actually see the questions coming up here.
No, that's okay. I think people had asked questions before you displayed this, but there's one interesting one here. How well does this model cope with more abstract concepts such as personal development? Like where would that fit into your little map here?
Yeah, it doesn't cope well with the individual personal development, and another thing it doesn't cope well with is the development of an innovation over time, which is particularly important, such as the way that the relative advantage might shift as time goes on and is adapted. So the question is probably more about the ability of individuals to improve their skills and capacity in using innovation, but at the same time, innovation can also evolve. So that's one of the constraints, I guess, and it's a very difficult thing to predict when you're thinking of something that might be very much still at the research phase and then looking forward. So it's not included at the moment, but it is a factor that I would consider, we are considering sort of looking at in terms of the potential for an innovation itself to be able to be improved by individuals or improved by the population so that the relative advantage changes. So I haven't answered that question directly, but it's a good question in terms of highlighting the fact that it is a static approach at this stage to considering both the ability of the population and the potential relative advantage of the innovation.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Let's keep moving because there are a number of questions from people about what the questions in the model look like, and I know you're about to talk about that. So. Okay.
I'm glad I can't see all those questions. They might be distracting me. Can't quite see them all on the screen there. So let's go into some questions. Now, obviously, there's 22. I'm not going to run through them all, but I will touch on one from every quadrant. So these are some actual responses when we used it for that Lupin example that I briefly mentioned earlier. By going back to people who were there, involved at the beginning of that Lupin diffusion period in Western Australia. So first of all, a very simple one. So you can see over here on the right-hand side of the screen, which as it appears in the model, it's telling you what quadrant we're talking about. So we're starting with the relative advantage for the population. as a simple one, it's enterprise scale. So it's just a factor that considers the fact that often you could be considering a large population, but it's only a small population, a small part of that population where the innovation would have a major benefit on a major enterprise. And in the case of a cropping innovation like lupins, back in the 1980s, there would have been a lot of farmers who are very livestock oriented, and cropping may well have been a very small part of their operations. So it's a way of factoring that in, such as if you're delivering an innovation to mixed farming where it's only very small, that what you're contributing is only a very small part of their overall enterprise, it does affect the potential relative advantage of an innovation. Just going around, so you can see we've shifted to the learnability characteristics and just focusing on one, the trialability. How easily can the innovation be trialed on a limited basis before a decision is made to adopt? So how cheaply can you learn about it on farm before considering, to allow you to assess its relative advantage? And you can see the responses are very simple. It's just a choice of 5. There are other examples where it's more than that, but in here it's just a very simple categorization of how trialable the innovation might be. And you can see some examples are provided here that sort of guide people in that. Moving up to the learnability characteristics relating to the population. So, and this is once again is a relatively simple one, innovation awareness. So what proportion, what's the starting point that you're considering here? What proportion of the target population would be aware of the existence or the trialling of the innovation in their local district? So often the awareness phase is considered as a phase before the learning phase for learning about an innovation. And where this high awareness has already been achieved, basically it reduces that time to adoption. It doesn't affect peak adoption in any way. It's not linked to that, but it does reduce that, potentially reduce the time to peak adoption. And an interesting example that Jeff found in testing this is in the cotton industry, for example, with some of the new cotton varieties where there's, in GM cotton varieties, where there's been a big build-up to the release. So there's very high levels of awareness, people waiting to adopt in this particular case before it's allowed to be released. So we found that we weren't probably accounting for this very well in our initial models, and in some cases you really do have sort of high accumulated awareness that really can reduce that learning phase substantially. So that's sort of something that we did pick up by looking at some of these more rapidly adopted innovations, that often the awareness and the learning can happen before the product is released. In terms of relative advantage, I haven't selected one of the profitability ones, but I have selected ease and convenience. So to what extent would the use of the innovation affect the ease and convenience of the management? Not something you can easily put a dollar value on, so we're not asking people to do that. But as I mentioned earlier, I think increasingly this is a factor that's particularly important, and that goes a long way to explaining why some practices are adopted despite not necessarily having high levels of profitability, but the ability to reduce management demands on farm. Now moving, so that's 22 questions we've skipped through, and I've only shown you 4. And this is the outcome of the tool. This is the output, so this is what's produced. And it's worth pointing out that this fitted curve, it's a Bezier curve, is all that's been fitted, but it's really just running off two points. You can modify the shape of it if you have some existing information about some of this middle space here, but really we're producing this curve just off a point describing the peak and the time to that peak. In the case of lupins, in this case, for this particular region that it was looking at, 12 years to 90% peak adoption, so we're not actually, up here we're not showing time to what we think might be complete adoption, it's just 90%, knowing that this period from 90% to 100% can take a long time and often are very difficult if you're dealing with extension, for example. And so we're presenting 90% here, and the time from the time of first availability or first adoption across. So that's the output that a lot of people are looking for, and that's the output that a lot of people need to include in a lot of cost-benefit type analyses, as well as other funding applications and things like that. It's that sort of information people are requested to provide, and our aim here is to provide a more structured way, at least, of reaching that. Going back to the actual example of Lupin diffusion, so this was a case for central wheat belt of WA, which includes Corrigan. So we figured it worked okay for that particular region. There are certainly higher adoption levels further north in the Midlands, but that's just one of the examples that we use for validation, and we hope in the future we'll have a lot more opportunities to do more validation of this tool in a broader range of industries. Now, something that was strongly requested in a lot of the workshops that we ran in front of hundreds of people, and so I think some of you have probably sat through some of those workshops. People really wanted to see what the drivers were. I mean, it can come across as a bit of a black box. We've tried to explain, what the factors are that are included and how they interact, but people did want to get a much better feel, particularly those who are shaping projects, thinking about what an innovation might need to look like to be highly adopted. What are the factors that drive adoption or are important? So here we've included a sensitivity chart that shows what would happen if you did change some of the characteristics of either the population or the innovation. In this case, this is just showing the one for peak adoption level. So a lot of the learning characteristics through here aren't having an influence. So a lot of these are the factors more related to profitability, in this case, in the case of Lupin's, which doesn't necessarily have high profitability. So there is a chance to look at what the drivers are and then model sensitivity to different inputs. Now, so that's a quick look through the model. There might be a chance for more questions later, but just finally, I'd just sort of reinforce it. As we've found, there is an ongoing need and demand to predict the potential diffusion of innovation. So we're hoping that this, whilst certainly not including all factors, it does provide some structure as a way to approach that. And that structure is based around those four characteristics or quadrants: characteristics of the innovation of the population, and the actual advantage of using innovation, and the ability to learn of the actual advantage of the innovation. And just to reinforce again that our aim here is not just prediction, but to produce an easy-to-use tool that can inform and allows people who wouldn't normally go through a structured approach to tackling these sorts of things and engage them in considering these factors when considering their projects and adoption and diffusion. I'll leave that slide up there, John. That's where people can download the tool from, and also an example of some of the other literature that's been developed by some of the book edited by David Pannell there, and Frank Van Clay, that includes some of the studies that have contributed to our thinking, I guess, in developing this tool. And there's also just a very small selection of what I guess we'd regard as the classics that have really helped our thinking in this endeavour. Perhaps hand back to you, John.
Great, thanks for that, Rick. So there are a few questions, so I'll just grab what I think are the priority ones. So the first one is, Rick, if investors use this tool, how do we ensure that funds are not moved away from areas with already low industry support, assuming that they'll get lower scores? So I'm assuming you've had discussions with some of the funding bodies. How are you seeing their use of this particular program?
Yeah, well, we certainly wouldn't like to think that it's just being used to fund and not fund projects. I mean, I guess the basis for our approach is that you do need some consideration of likely adoption, and you can reach that either through guesswork or perhaps a more structured process. The other, and there's full recognition that some of the most successful innovations, high-impact innovations, won't necessarily be highly adopted. They can have massive impact for a small part of the agricultural population, for example. And the other important thing to consider here is that we're really only talking about half the story. We're only talking about predicting the percent or the proportion of a population that will adopt that is, make the first steps to using the innovation. It doesn't explain extent of use, which really does involve another process. That's not relevant for some innovations where it's a lumpy innovation. You're either using it and you're not, or you're not. But other examples, such as the no-till example that I showed, you could be using it on just a small part of your land or 100% of your land. And it's that can be a major factor in how successful or what the impact of an innovation might be. So by no means are we assuming this is a single tool. And from our experience with RDC so far, their interest has largely been at helping teams of people in regions, for example, who are considering a different projects, just to consider these factors and perhaps consider a suite of factors. And in some cases, it doesn't necessarily change how you might think, whether you think something's worth pursuing or not, but it perhaps provides a more realistic perspective on timeframes, and it can also provide a more realistic perspective on what the potential drivers and factors to consider might be if you were aiming to increase likely adoption or reduce the time to adoption.
Thanks, Rick. And what about disadoption? So one of our astute listeners has commented that the Lupin area in Western Australia has dropped dramatically since the early 90s. So how does disadoption fit into your model?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it doesn't. So, and you will have seen the curve that we produced there, just flat lines, and I meant to point that out when I put that slide up, which of course is completely realistic, and it's not what you want. You don't want a single innovation to stay there for eternity. You would hope that something better would come along, and disadoption is a good thing in the case of crop varieties, where you hope disadoption occurs regularly because a better variety, for example, is coming along. So like I said before, it is predicting that first phase of people adopting an innovation, and it doesn't tackle what happens after that, both in terms of extensive use or disadoption.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Rick. Now, I'm going to need to wrap things up in a moment. So the final question, Rick, is where are you going from here with Adopt? Because in fact, one of the listeners is asking whether the same sort of questions will be relevant in other countries. So can you tell us a bit about where you're going from here with your Adopt program?
Yeah, we very much assume we've just produced the beta version, which is what we're calling it, and it is really the first phase. There's still a lot more testing and validation we'd like to do beyond the sort of comfort zone, I guess, we've been working in so far, and there's still a lot of improvements we would like to make. So those improvements are both to the core model, but also we've been quite amazed actually at the range of interest from people wanting to apply it to a whole range of different scenarios. I mean, it's not designed for intensive industries either yet. And I mentioned earlier that there's also been a lot of interest from people involved in smallholder developing countries, and already we've sort of started some work looking at what would need to be included to better predict likely impacts in that scenario, and that becomes, there's a whole range of different factors that you might want to consider, but fortunately there's a massive amount of literature as well. A lot of studies have been done on potential impacts in smallholder developing scenarios, so that's an area that we're developing, largely driven by demand from that area of agricultural research.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rick. We're now into our last 5 minutes. So, Rick, on behalf of the 199 people who've registered for today's event and over 100 who've joined us today, I'd really like to thank you for the time and effort you've put into this. It's such a valuable resource. We accept it's still in the beta version and that you will no doubt be improving it. But look, thank you for showing us particularly the reasoning behind it. I've really valued that today as you've been presenting. So thank you for your time. Now, folks, I made mention at the beginning that I had a special announcement. Well, that is, I've now started a blog, and surprise, surprise, it's called Enabling Change Innovation. So this is the place for you to visit after the webinar to engage in an ongoing conversation about the topic. So I've invited Rick to follow our blog, And so this is where any of your unanswered questions from today's webinar, you can post them there, and Rick and I will keep watching there and respond as we're able. So within the next 24 hours, I'll be sending you out an email as a follow-up from today's webinar, and we'll have a link not only to the blog but also to a post-event survey. Now, a cute little feature of the blog is that it's going to allow you to nominate and vote on future webinar topics. So instead of me trying to work out what's best, I'm wanting you to be suggesting topics. And so the webinars are going to be held every 6 weeks or so, and I'll try to stay one step ahead of you by announcing the next topic at the end of the previous webinar. So today I'm pleased to announce that the next webinar will be the Science of Innovation, Evidence-Based Methods to Drive Creative Thinking. So this will be held on Wednesday the 4th of July, and our presenter will be none other than Dr. Amantha Imber, who is the head inventiologist at Inventium in Melbourne. And Amantha is an innovation psychologist, and I'll tell you more about her when I announce the webinar by email in the future. Now, today I'd just like to acknowledge some of our partners who have helped bring together this webinar series, and the first is APEN, so the Australasia Pacific Extension Network. And so if you are in the extension and innovation business, and if you want to be better connected, better skilled, better presented, well, pop over to the APEN website and see how they can help you. Because APEN is the lead organisation for extension professionals working in primary industries, NRM and community development sectors. And in fact today we have the president of APEN joining us, Austin McLennan, but unfortunately he's come down with the flu. So he's unable to actually present at the moment, but I'm just drawing to your attention now the benefits of being an APEN member. So please contact them if you'd like more details. The other main sponsor of today's webinar, apart from the Queensland Government who pays my salary, is of course Citrix and their GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar products that we're using here today. So you can see here that if you're working with small groups of people, so up to 25 people, you can use the GoToMeeting, which has their high-definition video conferencing, and you can join in from an iPad or any computer. Today we've been using the GoToWebinar product, and this is where you can have up to 1,000 attendees, and you can easily set up a webinar in minutes with registration pages, automated emails, recording, polling and exit surveys. So that's what we've used today. So if you've enjoyed being able to join in our discussion today without travelling at all, you too might like to consider using one of these products for your work. And to help us with that, the good folk at Citrix are offering a free trial, and also there's a special offer. So you have only to mention that you attended today's webinar, and when you sign up for the GoToWebinar service, you'll get the first 2 months for free. So there are 3 great reasons to fill out an exit survey, which will appear on your screen as soon as I close the webinar. So the first is you'll get access to the handout slides. Secondly, you can request a free trial of GoToMeeting or webinar. And thirdly, you can then access this special GoTo subscription offer for the first 2 months for free. So in a moment, I'll close the webinar, and if all works well, this poll will pop up. And of course, I'll be sending you a link to a more detailed evaluation that, as I said, you'll get in the next 24 hours. So folks, our time has now elapsed. So it's been great having you along to this inaugural webinar. And again, Rick, thank you so much for your great presentation today. And we wish you all the best as you develop, adopt into the future. And we look forward to hearing the good things that you do there. So folks, I'll now close the webinar and wish you all well, and we'll be in touch. Thanks then.